Welcome back. So um, today I want to show you how to do manual tracking of emissions in Odoo. So before that, let's go to our documentation and see what we'll be able to find there and see what sense we can make of it. So here we have already seen how to track employee commuting, but there's also a way of doing manual input. So for example, so we can track an activity here. So we'll go to collect, emitted emissions, and we'll click new. But before you get your emitted emissions, you have to have emission factors, you have to have emission sources, and all that. And what is an emitted factor? An emission factor, what's an emission factor? An emission factor is a coefficient that indicates the rate at which a specific activity emits greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we have to have the activity and we have to have the factors. We also want to look at something down here. There's uncertainty. Uncertainty is the representation of the potential margin of error for the emission factor. So for example, if we say for activity X, we are emitting 500 kilograms of CO2, how sure are we that how sure are we of these figures? Yeah, so basically the numbers we're going to put there as uncertainty will basically be the margin of error between what we are reporting and the actual. There's also compute method, so we can actually give it in terms of unit, for example. So we are either going to give it in terms of physical quantities or monetary values. So for example, if you're going to take one flight, so that flight, how much CO2 is going to be emitted? So it's going to be a flight for one person per kilometer. So those are the physical quantities. But there's also monetary quantities, so basically monetary values spent. So for a specific emissions, what is a monetary value? And that's pretty much it. So we want to see how to do it manually, and we'll see how to do it now in Odoo. I'll go back to my database, and there we have it. So I'm going to go to ESG, and first things first, I have to have emission sources, and then I also have to have emission factors. I'll go to configuration, and there you have them. Emission factors, emission sources. There's also gases. You remember we are tracking 7 gases, and here is where I'm going to talk about kilograms of CO2 equivalent that are going to be emitted, because reporting is not done in form of all these 7 individual gases, but they are done in form of CO2. So basically CO2 equivalents. Let's go to sources. So by default, once you get into Odoo, you have some 12 sources, and I think we can just go into them. For example, stationary combustion, it's a scope 1 direct, it's a scope 1 emission, because this one is done on the premises of our company. So that's, for example, stationary combustion, mobile combustion, so when our cars are being utilized for people to travel. Process emissions, if you're running machines on the ground, etc. Fugitive emissions, for example, if there's repair for our fridge and there's emissions we want to track during that. Purchased electricity, that will be scope 2, as discussed in a previous slide. Purchased steam, heat or cooling, or any other form of energy. Remember, this energy is not generated on our premises, but it is used on our premise. So that's scope 2, and you can always refer to either the GHG protocol, or you can look at the slides we have made. There's neutral, so remember the scope 3 are the hardest to account for. So there are 15 categories of how you can actually go about this. There's purchased goods and services, so these are basically the upstream and the downstream activities, and that is why down here you have the activity flow. Upstream is all the activities before we get to our company or before we get to our premises. Downstream is all the activities after our premises. So for example, the case that I'm looking at is we are building bicycles. We are a bicycle startup. So the manufacturing of the bicycles and everything that goes into it within our premise, that's scope 1. That's direct. But now there are things you're going to buy from suppliers. Everything that goes into the supply chain, the value chain, just before the things we need for the manufacture get to our premises. Those are upstream activities. Once we build our bicycles and we've sold them out there, are there emissions that are going to go with their use, etc. Those are the downstream activities. And so that's why here you see for activity flow you have both upstream and downstream. So I'm just going to leave it there, not going to change anything. And then there's capital goods, the things we buy, fuel and energy related activities, upstream transportation and distribution, waste generated in operations, business travel, employee commuting, upstream list assets, downstream transportation, blah blah blah. So I want to use business travel. So let's say some people in my company have traveled overseas. So those are the sources. I want to go to emission factors. So emission factors, here I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to say, so I had an employee who traveled to Warsaw. Warsaw is in Poland. So I'm going to say travel to Warsaw. So employees travel to Warsaw in my company often. So I'm going to look for this number, the emissions, anytime someone goes to and from Warsaw in Poland. I'm going to select the source. So the source here, already you can see it's business travel. I've already shown you where this is. And I can select the company. This is my company. The region here I'll select, I believe it's Europe, and it's Poland. And I can give validity. So I want someone who's going to travel from 23rd. So want to put it like that. Uncertainty, this is something you're also going to discuss. I want to compute it by quantity. And here on database, there are two databases, but let's do it manually before we start using our database within the system. Unit of measure, I want to say it's a unit. I want to call it just one flight, the to and fro flight. I want to treat it as a unit. So I'm going to put it here. Now the gas emissions, I can either type it in here directly, or I can go one by one selecting the gas. So how much carbon dioxide is emitted? How much methane is emitted, how much fossil methane, blah blah blah. But that's a tedious process. So I'm just going to get the equivalent and put it in here as a big number, and I'm also going to get the uncertainty here. Let us do a little experiment. I want to go and book the flight for this person, so I'm just going to go to Google Flights. Want to keep things simple, and I want to let's find some cheap flights worldwide. So I'm going to go from Nairobi, that's where we are, that's JKIA, and I'm going to go to Warsaw, and let's land there. Let's select 23rd because this is the first time you're actually going for the business trip, and let's get back on Monday, 2nd March. So I'm going to select done, and we are going to search for the plane. Okay, let's go with Air France, for example. So before even we select you can see on this page you have the airline, you have the time, you have the stop, and this is the data you need. What are the average emissions? So many companies will go with the cheapest, or some people will go with class, but us guys, probably we want to minimize our emissions, so definitely you'd go with the 429, and you can see it's giving you negative 18% emissions. But let's go with Air France just to keep things simple. So if I go with Air France, I can see that the emissions that are there for the one-way flight was 506. So let me just go back. This was 506, and I just want to see how much. I want to see the details. So this flight is 506 kg of CO2. Typical for this route is usually 520, so it's 14 kgs lower, and you can see it's giving me CO2 equivalent. So equivalent, in other words, all those gases, the emissions, all the seven greenhouse gases have been summarized into CO2 equivalents. So this is 506, but I can go and learn more about emissions. So you can come here and do all this reading. And I just want to show you that doing this manually is quite hectic, and that is why we are going to do some importation of databases into Odoo, and these are the things we are going to be using. So you can see for one flight, one route, we are having 506. So if I choose that route, remember we are having to and fro return flights, and then coming back, I will choose still Air France, and I can see it's 503 for the return. So that gives me a total of 506 plus 503 emissions. And how sure are we that these are the emissions you're going to get during the trip? So that is where the uncertainty factor comes in. So if we go back to our database, I'm just going to put here that it's going to be 506 plus 503, and I want to give a description. So it is 506 plus 503 if we use Air France. And I can put a date here, and I can say this was from 23rd 02 to 0203. So that, of course, these emissions would be changing. Next time I just need to create it manually. And I save it. And that's it. So we've looked at our emission sources, and we have looked also at our emission factors. Now let's go and collect. Let's go and collect some emissions. So let's say someone has already flown to Warsaw and has come back. So we want to report that as a company. So I'm going to create new. Going to say travel to and from Warszawa. Or that's how they say it. So when was the date? 23rd. When was the return flight? Going to say 2nd. Okay. What is the emission factor we are using? Travel to Warsaw on that time. And quantity is, it was one flight. So this one flight is giving me 506 plus 503 kilograms of CO2 emitted. Now we forgot to put the emission factor. So I'm just going to duplicate this one. Let's say we have a margin of error of, let's say, 20%, because remember it's not that accurate. So I'm going to go to my factors, and here I'm going to say it's 10%, yeah, give or take. Okay, so let's travel to and from Warsaw. So if I refresh this page, there you have it. So we have an uncertainty factor of 10%. And so we have collected it, and I can give notes, and I can say employee travel for work during the period. Used Air France. Now probably from reporting we'll decide now we will not be using Air France anymore, we'll be using another one. So that's it for how to get the manual inputs. Okay, so once we have collected it, I want us to just go and measure and give some reporting. So let's go to our carbon footprint, and what do you see, everyone? You see the scope 1 emissions, and you also see the scope 3 emissions. How much is scope 3? 1.01, and I can just have a breakdown, and I can see it was business travel, and I can see it was travel to Warsaw. This was the amount. Scope 1, you remember this was employee commuting to date, and so you can see total carbon footprint for me is 1.11. There's another way to measure. So we can just go to carbon analytics, and you can see, for example, so because I have some data from 2023 and I have some data from 2026, you can see for scope 1 I have 0.11, for scope 2 I have 1.01. So that's it for doing it manually. I'll meet you in the next video where I'll show you how to do it now to simplify it a little bit. Ciao and have a good time.